This is World Review with Ivo Daalder, our weekly look at news from around the world here on Substack. I am so pleased to have with us two people who could not explain what is happening in terms of the U.S. relationship with countries in Asia than Ken Moriyasu, who is the Washington correspondent for Nikkei Asia, and Gideon Rockman, who is the foreign affairs commentator for the Financial Times. Gideon was just in China and Taiwan just before the president flew off to his marathon, though short, trip to Asia. Ken, let's start with you. He got on a plane about 7 days ago to fly to Malaysia and had another stop in Japan and then in South Korea. But what do you think the president was hoping to achieve, and did he achieve it?
Thanks, Ivo. It's great to be back. So we're 10 months into the second administration of Donald Trump, and it seems very different from the first term. He seems like a man in a hurry. He's getting a lot of things done, the tariffs. There seems to be no hesitation about implementing his policies. But the only thing that was not clear was his China strategy and his Indo-Pacific strategy. So I think the significance of this trip was that we finally got to see the contours of his China policy and the Indo-Pacific policy. And I think there were two big takeaways for me. One is the very casual use of the word G2. As he was heading into the meeting with Xi Jinping, he said, "Off to my G2 meeting with Xi Jinping." I think that really captures everything. The second part is the people he didn't meet and the topics he didn't talk about. So he did not go to India for a Quad summit, although this year is India's turn to host the Quad summit, and he could very well have stopped by in India. He didn't do that. And Prime Minister Modi did not come to ASEAN as expected. If he had gone, there could have been a US-India summit, but he didn't want to do that. That tells us something. The second non-issue was the fact that in the Trump-Xi meeting, apparently Taiwan was not discussed. So that kind of tells us about the nature of Trump's China policy. He does not envision Taiwan or war. I think he's focused on stability and on trade. And finally, I think we got to see his attitude towards allies. It doesn't start with this trip. It starts actually a week before when Albanese of Australia came. Trump gave a very strong endorsement of the AUKUS submarine package. There was rumors that Elbridge Colby, the Undersecretary of Defense, did launch the review, and he was willing to scrap it. But that was shot down. And on this trip, I think the overall message to Japan and South Korea and the Southeast Asian partners was very positive. There wasn't any demand of like increasing host nation support or, increasing defense spending to 5% or 3%, 5%, like Elbridge Colby has been pounding the table on. So it's not clear. It's not a good versus evil. It's not democracy versus autocracy, but it is stability with China. And in that race, the allies, Japan and South Korea, are not abandoned. They're kind of, as seen in the AUKUS package, he does take care of the allies, but not to prepare for a war with China, but for stability. And in this stability, I think he wants to get trade deals done.
A lot to unpack there, Gideon. I think that was a really excellent summary. Particularly, I like the things that didn't happen, the dog that did not bark part of it. The other thing I would add that didn't happen is he didn't actually go to the APEC meeting, which is the ostensible reason that he went to the region. He skipped it, leaving the playing field to Xi Jinping and to some extent to the new Japanese Prime Minister Takeshi. Gideon, when you looked at sort of the Trump trip, which part do you want to pick up on, or what struck you most about this trip?
Well, a couple of things. I mean, first of all, I think, and particularly having been to China, and maybe I was kind of, over influenced by their view. Obviously, that's what they're trying to do. But I think that the Chinese feel they've got the measure of Trump and that they feel they've got a weapon in rare earths that will make him back off on trade. And this is the second time it's happened that Trump has made pretty outlandish threats of tariffs of 100%, 145%. And they brandished the rare earths weapon, and he's had to be more conciliatory. Obviously, the Trumpian readout was very Trumpist, total triumph, 12 out of 10. The Chinese readout was much more laid back, but I think that they won't be delighted by 45% tariffs, which seems to be where we're at now. But I think the bigger thing is that they know they've got a lever or a tap that they can turn on and off that will get the Americans to the table pretty quickly. And most people think it's going to be a decade or more to reduce American dependence on rare earths. And that is a pretty potent weapon that they have there. And I think it plays into a broader sense that the Chinese also think that the weapons that the US has tried to use against them to exert pressure, particularly tech controls, export controls, have not really worked that well because China's been quite adept at finding indigenous technological solutions. Archetypally, I think there was more or less an American effort to shut down or at least seriously hobble Huawei. But Huawei, built its own operating system domestically, is doing very well. It's still a big Chinese tech firm. So I think that I was struck. The FT ran a piece with a slightly provocative headline, saying not mine, saying that China and the US are now peers. And I think that may be the big takeaway from this, and we'll have to let the dust settle a bit. But it feels a bit like that. The second thing I think is that I was very interested that Ken said, well, Japan, South Korea will be fairly reassured. And yes, this particular kind of set of meetings were friendly and so on. But they've had to swallow extraordinary stuff from Trump. I mean, not just the 15% tariff, but these promises of hundreds of billions of investment into the US, which Trump gets to dictate where the money is, and then America supposedly keeps 90% of the profits. I mean, tell me if I've got that wrong, but that is the sort of public account of what's going on there, and that is an extraordinarily exploitative way to treat an ally, which does make me think that in the long run, I mean, I don't think it's good for America either, because I think it makes them think, we've got to find a way out of this excessive dependence on the United States at some point.
I mean, Ken, pick up on that point, because I think the way that Gideon described sort of now the new relationship to the United States and China rings true to me, this peer competitor idea that the FT was headlining today. But from a Japan perspective or a Korea perspective, or even a Australian perspective, there's this issue of the trade deals, particularly in Japan and Korea. The Japanese, I think if I'm right, the Japanese commitment of $550 billion is 14% of GDP. That's a lot of money in a country that only has $800 billion or so foreign reserves. So there's the whole question of how to do that. I think the Koreans got a slightly better deal because they can do it over 10 years in that sense. But secondly, the rare earths question is one that affects not just the United States, but affects all of them. And the only way it's going to be solved is for everybody to cooperate. But the United States is not a particularly good leader of allies to cooperate these days. So how are those two elements being played? How does Japan, country well, of course, but and other regional allies look at this relationship between the United States and China? And are they worried that the U.S. can make deals on their back that may be good for the United States, but not necessarily good for Japan?
Right. On the trade deal, Trump has described it as a signing bonus, that it's cash handed over from Japan to America. I don't think that's the case. Japan perfectly thinks that there are investments and loan guarantees. The 90% profit happens only after the Japanese side recoups its investment. So that's way down the road. There's a little wiggle room there. It's interesting how Trump is not really interested in forcing Japan to increase its defense spending to 5%. he'd rather have that money come into America as investment. So that's a very practical side of Trump. We'll see what happens. I think there is appetite for Japanese companies to invest in America, and it's tied to the Taiwan question. I think. I mean, for Japanese companies to invest in America, there has to be a clear outlook that there will be no war with China, and I think this is hand in hand. This is also related to the rare earths issue. China has dominance over rare earths. Rare earths are used in F-35 submarines, UAVs, and radars. And quite frankly, America cannot go to war with China if the rare earths are shut down. China always had this dominance, but it's interesting how they didn't know how to leverage it against the US. Ironically, it's the export controls that the US used on China that taught the Chinese how to leverage it. So the export controls on rare earths announced in October were mirroring the tactics that the Americans used on China. So that has been paused, kicked down the road for 1 year, but every year there will be renegotiations. China will continue to hold the leverage. As Gideon said, it takes 10 years to establish alternative rare earths. I think parallel to that, creating a non-China supply chain, there will be efforts to move to weapons that don't rely on rare earths. That is going full steam ahead. But also, under this very big context, I think there will be push to make sure that a war doesn't happen. Because it's practically very difficult, becoming increasingly difficult for the US to wage war in the next 10 years. But after 10 years happens, the Pentagon assessment is that China itself would not be in a position to maintain its defense spending, and therefore the risk of China subdues with each passing year. So if all goes well, there should be peace.
If all goes well, there should be peace. The famous last words of Ken Moriyasu. We're going to hold you to that. The problem is, what's the all, and what goes, and what's well in that statement. But I admire the optimism here, and but I do hope there is also alternative thinking happening in other parts of the country, and in other parts of Asia. Gideon, you already started talking about the U.S.-China relationship, but of course the big deal was that turned out an hour and 40-minute meeting, which, if you divide it in terms of translation, really meant 70 minutes, a little over an hour of negotiations. First, what do you think happened? Because we have a Chinese version of it and we have the Donald Trump version of it. And secondly, and I think equally importantly, what do you think this implies for the way going forward? Because in many ways, like so much of Trump's efforts, this is a ceasefire rather than a resolution. And ceasefires tend to break down. So how do you look into the future?
Well, yes. I mean, I think that the Chinese, I mean, looking at it from their perspective, will probably be fairly relieved. When I was in Beijing, the point was made to me by a Western diplomat that the Chinese would be very wary of a meeting with Trump because they hate putting Xi in unscripted situations where he could be embarrassed. And Trump is Mr. Unscripted, so their vision of a meeting is that it's all prepared incredibly carefully. You know the outcome. And so this was a slightly risky deal for them. Fortunately, it wasn't like one of those kind of televised Oval Office confrontations with the press sitting there. So that took out some of the risk for them. And I think that you're right. I mean, no deal with Trump is permanent because of his ability to take offense or to turn on a dime. But I think that the thing we were talking about earlier, the rare earths chokehold, does mean that it's slightly harder for Trump to turn around in a week's time and say 145% tariffs, because he's tried that twice and seen that the Chinese have a real riposte. I think the whole question of Taiwan and so on is obviously crucial. And there, I think there has been a big change of mood from the Biden administration. I mean, I was very struck at the height of the middle of the Biden administration, when the Pelosi visit really, and then the balloon over America really ramped up the tensions, that how openly people were talking of the possibility of a war between the US and China. I mean, it was quite scary, to be honest. Trump, to his credit, has taken some of the heat out of that. And let's hope that that can be done without simultaneously selling Taiwan down the river. If he takes the heat out of it, but the result is that Taiwan falls into China's grasp, that's not good for the Taiwanese or actually for the United States in the long run, for reasons we can go into. In Taiwan, it was very interesting. I mean, I think that they're pretty nervous of Trump. But it depends on who you talk to. There are those who say, look, the Chinese assumption that if America just cuts Taiwan loose, it's over for Taiwan, which I heard in Beijing, I think kind of underplays Taiwanese agency, just as the Russians kind of underplayed Ukrainian agency. They think these countries are just sort of vassal states who will in the end do what they're told by the United States. That was a misreading of Ukraine, and I think it's a misreading of Taiwan. I mean, Taiwan is a small place, 23 million people, and kind of, in a way, a wealthy place that's not that interested in war. It's not very martial and all of that. But it's a very hard place to invade, and I think even if China were to attempt to do it, it's D-Day times 3. Even if the Americans didn't intervene, okay, maybe China would eventually prevail. But crossing a sea like that in the face of the anti-ship missiles that we've seen in the Ukraine war can do enormous damage, would have to entail accepting huge losses. So I have to hope that Xi thinks maybe not, and that he'll try to get his way in another way by subverting Taiwanese democracy or propaganda efforts or economic pressure, but fall short of war.
On both of those points, the stability of the deal and the likelihood that it will continue to be implemented, and I assume after 1 year the extension will be negotiated. On the one hand, and Taiwan sort of now that we should be a little bit more willing to sigh with some relief that the possibility of a conflict between China and Taiwan is less, because the United States has kind of lowered the temperature on this. How do you see both of those things, and how do you think people in the region see that?
Well, so the absence of Taiwan is very interesting. Like I said, it's not just in this meeting, but the September phone call between Trump and Xi, there was no mention of Taiwan, which is very rare. In the call before that, I think it was June, Xi Jinping did mention Taiwan, but apparently Trump did not mention Taiwan once from his side. So in the Chinese, of course, there was no mention of Taiwan in the American readout in June, but even in the Chinese readout, it wasn't it wasn't like two leaders had a discussion on Taiwan. Xi Jinping made his case on Taiwan. In the September call, there was no mention of Taiwan, and this time, apparently, if we believe Trump's words, there was no discussion on Taiwan. I think the Chinese are comfortable about Trump's view on Taiwan. He just isn't interested. He's more focused on trade, tariffs, export control, rare earths, and the Chinese, I think, are fine with that. I think there is a perception in Washington that Xi wants to take Taiwan now, and he's not hesitant to use military force to do that. I don't think that's the case. I think the game plan is to win without fighting, and that Taiwan is the last piece of the puzzle. And in 1949, Taiwan, in China's plan, in their best case scenario, Taiwan will fall into the Chinese orbit, and that will be the last piece of the puzzle that ends Pax Americana and begins Pax Sinica. That's the game plan. I don't think that Xi Jinping wants to wage a war right now. So I think there's a little mismatch in the discussion here.
I think that's interesting. I think it's important to stress your point that when the goal hasn't changed on the Chinese part, but the means, in some ways, you could think that what China is trying to do is to not just become the peer competitor, but the dominant power in Asia in order to then force the question down the road. And Gideon, my sense, and you said that early on, my sense is that from Beijing, nothing that happened in the last week, including in the hour and 40-minute meeting with Trump, suggests that this idea that China is becoming stronger and the West and the United States is becoming weaker, that in any way has been nullified by what has happened. To some extent, it's been strengthened. The confidence of the Chinese seems to be big and growing.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, Trump is a bit of a gift for them, I'm afraid, because what they want to say to America's allies across Asia is don't rely on America. This guy's fundamentally unreliable, and everything Trump does more or less reinforces that message. From putting tariffs on close allies. Taiwan got 20%, incidentally, higher even than Japan and South Korea, to musing openly about whether he would ever fight for, American allies, to talking incredibly warmly about Xi Jinping, even about Kim Jong-un, to making it clear his abhorrence of war, etc., etc., etc. So all of that means that Chinese messaging is kind of reinforced. That said, translating those doubts into actually displacing America from the dominant position in the Asia Pacific is hard. I think that you probably need a symbolic moment, and maybe the symbolic moment is the taking of Taiwan. But the problem is the Taiwanese aren't playing ball, and are you going to actually invade, as we were discussing? That's a pretty tough call. And I think that it's interesting that there's an echo here in Europe, that even as these doubts mount about America across Asia, 80 years of relying on America means that most countries don't have a plan B. Japan doesn't, South Korea doesn't, Australia doesn't, just as Britain doesn't. And I think if you're in a security pact with the United States, explicit or implied, as with Taiwan, you're in a very tight situation. The countries that can begin to hedge much more quickly are countries like India, where you see Modi, who is already taking Russian oil, Russian weaponry, to immediately go to China, start talking to Xi Jinping, allegedly refuse to take phone calls from Trump. He can do that. It's not comfortable, but that Indian security and national security policy is not built around the United States as Japanese, South Korean, Australian policy is.
So, interesting. Did India? I want to talk about that, and Ken, you talked about that too. So I'll get back to that in a second. But I was really interested to read Xi Jinping's speech to the APEC meeting, which was very much making explicit the argument, Gideon, that you made, which is you can rely on China, but you cannot rely on the United States.
Yeah.
And interestingly enough, of course, one of the meetings that happened is a meeting between Mark Carney, the first meeting that a Prime Minister of Canada's had with Xi Jinping in 8 years.
Yeah.
And Mark Carney is one of those leaders who has concluded that despite its geographic and geopolitical and economic relationship with the United States, something fundamental has changed and needs to have a new direction. And I wonder, Ken, when particularly to Southeast Asian leaders, a little less than Korea and Japan, who have less agency in this sense, but they're sitting there and say, really, I can't really count on the United States anymore. If you're Singapore or Malaysia or Cambodia, even though the latter two signed trade agreements with the United States, or Vietnam, which is actually very much changing direction. Is it time to say we can no longer afford not to choose, and we were going to choose Beijing over Washington?
Right. this very interesting topic, and it's a live discussion among the ASEAN countries. As you said, on this trip, Trump succeeded in signing trade deals with Malaysia and Cambodia, but with Vietnam and Thailand, he only managed to get a framework of an agreement, which kind of signals that Vietnam and Thailand were not as comfortable as Malaysia and Cambodia in accepting the rules, the conditions that the Trump administration was laying out. And if you look at the Malaysia-Cambodia deals, they go far beyond tariffs and trade, and they kind of force these countries, not force, but request or demand from these countries to align politically with the Trump America First agenda. For instance, on export controls, entity lists. These countries, Malaysia and Cambodia, have promised to observe the Americans' Commerce Department's entity list and force similar regulations on their own companies in dealing with these companies. Vietnam, Thailand was not that comfortable in aligning, because all these Southeast Asian countries, their basic strategy is to not choose between the US and China, always hedging. But this Trump administration trade deal negotiation is kind of forcing them to take sides. But to take one step back, and not just Southeast Asia, but allies as a whole, Japan, South Korea, how do we deal with the US, and can we rely on America to come to the rescue if there is a contingency? I think one thing is clear, that this is no longer Reagan's America or George W. Bush's America or Biden's America. So it's very wrong to expect that just because Japan and South Korea have a treaty with America, that automatically triggers an Article 5 kind of intervention by the US military. So, of course, Japan and South Korea have to be prepared to defend on its own, including the nuclear option, and also hedging with China. But looking at India, I'm not so sure India is comfortable in its current position, hedging between Russia and the US. I think a better alternative for Japan, especially, is to look at the future of America, the MAGA base, where it's going. And this is a topic for another Substack, but MAGA and Japan are very compatible in the values, in like the focus on the family, keep making sure that people have jobs rather than maximizing salary. There are a lot of compatible things. If there is a way that Japan can tap into the MAGA mentality, I think there's a bright future for the alliance.
Well, that's an interesting proposition, and maybe that is what Mr. Farage is trying to sell in the UK. It's certainly what Geert Wilders tried to sell in the Netherlands. Didn't work very well in the election there. I do wonder, though, and last word to you, Gideon, on sort of the degree to which, on the one hand, allies no longer really believe that they can count on the United States. And just on this Article 5, President Trump has given Qatar a bigger and more significant Article 5 through executive order than he has given, than the United States has with both Japan and South Korea, which is in and of itself interesting about the value of Article 5 in the Trump administration.
And the value of giving the president a plane.
Yeah, exactly. You just give it to people, and you can take it away. Presumably, is that so? There's the unreliability, but the other one is the dependence issue. And so, what do you do? I'm struck that the country that is most dependent on the United States, Canada, is also the loudest when it comes to the need for independence. And is that a lesson for allies both in Asia and in the in Europe?
Yeah, I mean, one has to remember, of course, that the threats made to Canada are more extreme than anything we in Britain or Japan have to think about, to actually, say, well, we think you should become part of our country. You would have had a pretty extreme backlash, I think, in the UK or something. But yeah.
I mean, unless we ask Charles to be our king.
Yeah. We could do a reverse takeover, sure. I have no problem with that. You could have Andrew, actually. He's free at the moment. Yeah, I think that nonetheless, for Canada to be hedging against the United States is really remarkable. I mean, there is no other country that's more geographically, economically dependent even in security terms, than Canada on the United States. And so even if they think, well, despite those geographic and economic realities, we have to try to find a way of distancing ourselves from the United States, it surely must raise questions for others. I mean, in Britain, it's a problem because, we shot ourselves in the foot by leaving the European Union, which is the obvious alternative to America. So we have relatively few alternatives. Japan, in a funny way, I've always thought is a bit slightly the Britain of Asia, both of the continent, but not quite, and therefore sort of doesn't have a total alternative to America. So, but, Trump, these levels of dependency on America were built up over 80 years because America seemed like such a good bet and such a reliable country, and a country that, through law, through economics, through its political culture, was the obvious place to ally with. And as a result, that's led to very extreme levels of dependency, which gives Trump enormous leverage that he can use, which he is now using. But I think almost as international relations isn't physics, but there'll be a natural reaction, which is whether you talk about it loudly, as Carney is doing, and saying we've got to free ourselves from this dependency, or whether you say, yes, Mr. Trump, and can I nominate you for the Nobel Peace Prize, but privately say we've got to kind of give ourselves some options here. I think everybody is now going to have to hedge against American unreliability.
And then there's Xi Jinping, who says you got to hedge, and maybe one way is to align with us, and that's what we saw this week. Whether countries will or not, we don't know. The Singaporean prime minister once told the Americans, "Don't force us to choose between you and China because you may not like the answer." With that, I want to thank two outstanding observers and reporters on the world politics, and particularly on Asia. Ken Mariasu of Nikkei Asia and Gideon Rahman of the FT. We'll be back next week with another edition of World Review. Until then, all have a great weekend. Thank you so much. Take care. Bye-bye. Take care, guys.
Thank you.
Ciao.
Bye.